Now what I'm going to do very quickly, just to get through, is this was used the last day or two, and I wouldn't suggest taking notes, just getting kind of a flavour, because we just want to say, listen, as Mary said, we're dealing with a range of monuments. We'll focus down, Eamon will start looking specifically more in relation to graveyards, because there's quite a lot of issues associated with that. What we tend to find is that in our day-to-day work, most archaeological monuments are on private land. So they're on farmland, and the farmers generally know the sites, and there's issues associated mainly to do with land practices. Eamon will talk briefly on that using his farming expertise. Also, you have issues with maybe one-off houses, and the fact that maybe you have something that's built close to people might inadvertently want to build near a monument. But generally what I think most people here are involved in are in relation to monuments that are in the public realm, that idea that they're in the kind of public area. They may be owned by a church group, Catholic parish, the Church of Ireland, it could be on a street. It could be something to say, well listen, who owns this monument, and the whole issue. So generally what we find is that groups that are individuals here are generally dealing with things that are in public, either public ownership or more likely in the public realm. Just very quickly, I'm going to scoot through this in terms of a timeline for Irish archaeology. The emphasis here is that we can get into the minutiae of this, but I won't. Is that really the first kind of settlement that we know about? There is evidence for maybe tentative evidence for material before Mesolithic, but really it's generally accepted really in the Middle Stone Age, and then it leads to the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and right up to what archaeologists refer as the post-medieval period. Sometimes historians will call it the modern era. But I think what we just want to get across, the date ranges, if they're not written down for me, I tend to forget them, so I wouldn't be worried about taking the note about it. What I think is important to consider is it's all to do with, I think, the impact of human beings on the environment over time has increased significantly. The changes that we can make have evolved. Look, so here you're looking at a Mesolithic family grouping, kind of obviously an illustration done by a colleague of ours. But what I suppose is conscious is that natural materials, usually material like hides and timber, that are woodland material, that'll decay and leave very little trace. And if we looked at this from 100 years, or we find it now, what you might only find is the trace of some burnt areas, a scattering of stones. You might just find these flints. So at that era, when they had hunter-gatherers in the community, yes, they changed. Their impact on the environment is very, very light. It's really with the coming of agriculture that people tended to be more settled, and also then that there was clearance of forestry and starting to kind of change the landscape in that sense. And also you have introduction of new technologies like pottery, which does survive. Again, so this sense of that a changing range of monuments and impacts and interferences, if you will, with the landscape.
John, can I just interject there? I just have to head out. But the source of that information is it's about time. It's a primary and secondary school resource. So if you're interested in exploring any of this, it's available online.
Yes.
It's for primary and secondary schools.
Yes.
And so it's a fabulous resource.
Yeah.
Though I was involved in it myself.
Very good. No, it's fantastic. And the illustrations here are primarily by Rhoda Cronin, who's an illustrator. She worked with us. She's freelance and has done recent work for Clonakilty, isn't it? Isn't there? And various Dark Towns, yeah. But what I'm just getting at here is this idea that with time, the impact on the environment of human activity becomes greater. So you've got a variety of megalithic tombs. There's various types. There's core tombs. You can see here this distribution map. They're very much in Ulster and North Connacht. Quite few down in the south. You get megalithic tombs, and obviously those are kind of the classic, portal tombs. Classic dolmen. An example there, obviously near here is Agaglashan. And this would be a very sensitive site from an archaeological and from a conservation point of view. Like, this is something that community groups should not attempt or go near, or just, this is, you know, something that is, would have to take specialist archaeological led work. And I've seen megalithic tombs being conserved, but the important thing is to get all the archaeological work done in advance. If you're concerned about a monument, or you think it's been endangered or potentially damaged, then you can report it to the National Monument Service. Again, if you start using archaeology.ie, that'll give you advice. But generally in relation to megalithic tombs, we're not going to deal with issues like that because it's very specialised. But again, you've got passage tombs, which are obviously kind of Newgrange, Note and Dowd. Wedge tombs, which are great concentration of them down here in the southwest. Example, two or more. Where's that? Yeah, where's that? Yeah. And again, just into the Bronze Age, which kind of a time of two halves. The early Bronze Age, considered to be a golden era in Irish prehistory. But then in the latter half of the Bronze Age, there was significant climate change and degradation, and you went from a kind of a very successful, expanding society to one that was under threat. Right across Europe, we see examples of this kind of retreat in the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. But basically, a greater, again, seeing the fact is that a greater control of the environment by humans, that's what's obvious within it. The site types that are associated with that, you've got obviously Bronze Age, which is copper, obviously down the likes of Allihies, in Mount Gabriel, Skull. And again, this is something just, you know, these are features where material is taken away, but they are considered to be monuments as well. And what I just want to do here is give an understanding of the range of type of monuments that we have in the county. And obviously this time is the introduction of metalworking. In this case, casting bronze using molds. This will kind of come back when Pat's talking about cast iron. It's a kind of a similar technique, casting into a mold. And then look, the monuments that are associated with that would be the likes of Drumbeg Stone Circle. And these are, you know, people can identify these as monuments. Okay. But also you've got things like this, more innocuous ones like a boulder burial, or here an urn burial, which is an illustration, another one by Rhoda, I believe, of where people were interring cremated remains, digging a hole, placing the remains and putting an urn over it. And just, you know, so that's something from an archaeological point of view, or you could, that stone that sits across it may no longer be there. It could be ploughed away. Up here, modern ploughing, you know, it's unlikely to leave any surface trace. So, you know, the upper 30 centimeters of this could be heavily ploughed. It's often that these things are only found when people are digging a land drain, and you come in alongside, and that's often how they're typically found. But again, this is a monument as well, but it's a monument that leaves very little trace, and something that you can come across inadvertently. Okay, and there's other monuments as well. I mean, stone rows or stone alignments. It's a bit blurred there, and cup mark stones that you have from Cape Clear. Sorry, I'm going back there. And then the one that a lot of people know of are Fullofias. There's one down in Drumbeg here, which was excavated, but it shows a trough, in this case stone-lined trough, but often they were constructed in timber, split timber, oak timber, and it would be considered a trough of water. You had a fire heating stones, and these are stones that are being dropped in here to heat the water. For what purpose? Cooking, sweat house, whatnot, you know. There's a debate about it, but it's something that leaves trace. Particularly you'll see it in fields of where tillage is. You'll see burnt areas, and that's what indicates the location of where these features were. Okay. So this is just again giving a sense of the kind of range of monuments that you've got. Here, this is just a screenshot from the Historic Environment Viewer, and also showing the aerial photographs. So this is how this site is represented back in the 1840s, and the Ordnance Survey were taking care to map it and record the name associated with it. This is Castle Animid near Knockavilla, there just to the west of Bandon, isn't it? Yeah. and it shows the site here. Here you can indicate what archaeological work led by Professor Billy O'Brien of UCC. He's been doing programs of work there, excavating, and this is a Bronze Age monument, and he's excavated trenches across the ditch. And here what you have are these timber, they're actually telegraph poles or ASB poles. What he has done is fashioned those and popped them back to give an indication. Now it's not a full reconstruction, but it's given an indication of what the scale of the palisade fence that would have been around this. So what you have is that this fort would have had a ditch and bank, and on top of the bank you would have had a palisade fence. And this is just showing, again, another form of monument. We get into the Bronze Age, the whole idea, we talk about our Celtic past, but the question Celtic there in terms of exclamation mark or just quotations to say is that our sense now is that over time our sense is that changes. We're not maybe a Celtic people, but we're a people who took on Celtic ideas and Celtic culture. Just like since the 1940s and 1950s, we're all Americans because we're wearing blue jeans and so we're the American culture, or suppose this is, so when you hear people talking about Celtic past, what that's talking about is maybe the type of the traditions and the material culture that people were introducing, and it's something that's kind of hotly debated. So these are just Iron Age settlements. These are promontory forts, and you can see here it's just a headland, and what they've done is people here have constructed or dug a trench, thrown up a bank, and it's some form of defended settlement. Okay, and then we're coming into the early medieval period, and this is where the most common site across Ireland is the ring fort or the Rath, or Liss. You can see here 2 ring forts, and these were a time when cattle rearing and cattle were your wealth, and these are generally considered to be farmsteads, which would have been enclosed so that cattle could be brought in. We hear about kind of cattle raiding and so forth in this society. The raiding to take cattle off a neighbour, you needed to defend yourself because that was what your wealth, and you needed to defend it. So these sites are represent. And some of them are very impressive. These farm, some of them might be considered to have kind of royal association or local chieftains. Some are more grand than others. In this case, is one near Copine, and you've got 1, 2, 3 banks. So it's almost like a show. You don't maybe need that for defense purposes, but it's a way of showing your wealth and status. And here, then, this is an interpretation drawing again done by Rhoda, showing what this may have looked like in the past. And what you have is, again, bank and ditch with a palisade fence of timber along the top, here again, and a defensive entrance so that people could protect and close off and protect their cattle and bring it in if needs be. Okay, again, this is just to give a range of the monuments types that we've got. And I know most people will not be conserving unless it's on your own private land and you want to be actively conserving monuments. This is something, a souterrain, quite a lot around in West Cork. Generally, they're inside in the fort. They're associated with ring forts. In some instances, we have evidence of them extending out beyond, but that's relatively rare. And generally, they're either in areas where there's a lot of clay. They typically will be cut into the clay. But in other areas, maybe where there's a low soil cover, people will dig and break the rock and rebuild it, putting in rock-built or stone-built chambers. And people don't know whether they were used for storage, for refuge. There's kind of debate about that. And again, a bit like the urn burials, nowadays sometimes you might have no indication that there is an archaeological, that there's a ring fort on your land because it's all been ploughed away. But I've come across instances where a farmer is out driving and maybe has a new, heavier tractor, and they're driving along and suddenly the wheel just drops from under because the weight of the machine has meant is that this collapses. Okay, so these are things again that you might find and often come to attention. And just to give a flavour for the early medieval period, the Cranogues. But I think the critical, and this is where I'll be handing over to the likes of Eamon shortly, is that it's the coming of the church in the early Christian period. 5th century, 6th century on, it started kind of a transformation of Irish society in terms of settlement and whatnot. And you hear this is an idealized view, but typically church sites, we didn't have towns or significant settlements, but these became centres of learning for transmission of religious ideas, but also we're getting a better understanding that these were the proto-marketplaces. People would come to start trading, and obviously you would, to a certain degree, and over time, obviously towns developed later, but these were the first proto-towns or proto-settlements. And I think, look, we could talk about this in detail, but I think what's interesting here is you can see that the church is within a circular area, or sometimes oval, and then there's an outer enclosure where there's more secular activities. And that's what we find is that that pattern of development survives in even to this day. And this is someone's from Kilbrittain. Here you can see this is an aerial photograph of the site in Kilbrittain. The light here is a bit strong, but what you can see I think the church site, I haven't visited the site, but I understand the church is here. And the sense would be that, okay, the church and graveyard will be focused on this, but if you look, and again, apologies for the light, but you can see the curving outer bank there. If you have to believe me on this, there's a kind of a lightning. You see there's kind of lighter areas, yeah, right? So it extends around, and it turns back. Now, obviously, the road is later, cuts through. Obviously, the road is kind of more associated with this church. This church is later than an earlier church, but you can see how a place evolves, and you might be thinking that your monument is just here, but it's a significantly larger area. Okay, and that's something like we would often do reviews of aerial photography to find sites like this. But just again, quickly moving on here, we get into issues of, at this time you start seeing kind of Christian iconography, Christian forms in terms of grave slabs, likes of the kind of round tower. And what you have here is that these state, like we go into a lot of historic graveyards and you'll see high crosses. And that shows this idea of where the high crosses became very popular in the 1880s, 1890s onwards. I think it was Oscar Wilde's father, William Wilde, organised an exhibition in the National Museum in Dublin, talking and making casts of famous or spectacular high crosses from across the country. So they made, I think, fiberglass casts of these. They were brought and they had an exhibition in Dublin, and as they became all the rage. And then people decided, I want to commemorate my burial using a Celtic cross. So when you go into graveyards, you can see the Celtic crosses now have kind of come out of favour for commemoration, but they are very much a fashion associated with a heightened sense of nationalism at the time, an idea that we had a unique culture here in the island of Ireland, and it shows how some ideas that you take ideas from the past and use them for maybe your own purposes. This is just an ohm stone. Again, just a kind of form of lettering. And we're getting into the medieval period, the coming of Anglo-Normans, kind of a radical transformation of the society and the economy of the island. I've said the Anglo-Normans, introduction of ideas of castles, monastic orders. Before that, the Irish church was quite dispersed and quite local. And with the coming of the Anglo-Normans, the likes of the Cistercians, the Benedictines orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans started coming and had maybe a more kind of centralised power structure, and also being a very important landowner in the country. And then as well, you have the introduction of walled towns. So this just shows a distribution map across the country of archaeological sites from that time. And you can see there's kind of a density really down in the Wexford area, and dispersing out from there. And look, now these are slightly later features, obviously the late medieval tower houses, and these are a selection from West Cork. These are ones at Ballinacary, Kilcoe, prior to the works being done there, and likes of Desmond Castle in Kinsale. And the wall town, this is if you can make this out, this is a kind of a very simplified map of Kinsale, showing the streets, the current streets, the kind of double lines of streets, and then on the outline here, this black line that goes around here, down and around and around, that shows the extent of the walled town. And then in Bandon, another very good example, a later example of a town wall, of a walled town, sorry. And here we have mapping from the time showing the fact that you had settlements on both sides of the river Bandon. And that's another monument, like the walled, and that's something I suppose, Billy, increasingly people are understanding, like the walled town is becoming treated as a monument and acknowledged as such. And just an abbey, another site type, and obviously there's ones here in likes of Timleague and out in Shurkin. Okay, and just there, and this is where I just want to kind of hop off on this, is where we're aiming to start looking at, is generally the parish church, in most instances now quite ruinous. I remember being on a training course in England with masons who work on medieval churches and cathedrals, and the guy who was giving the talk was a chap by the name of John Ashurst, professor on architectural conservation, and he had done quite a lot of work in Cork. Kevin would remember John, unfortunately had passed away, but a great individual, very expert in his field. But he had worked in Israel, he'd worked in England, and throughout his presentation he would talk about projects that he worked on. And you'd see Lincoln Cathedral, and then he would look at Masada in Israel, and then he would take a photograph from a church, maybe in North Cork, that he had advised Cork County Council with, and there would be gasps in the audience. They were more impressed with what these churches than the other ones, because I chatted to one or two of the masons afterwards. I said, why is such an interest? He said, John, you don't understand. He said, when you're dealing with a parish church in England, generally that church has been in constant use. And when you look at the work, it's already been repaired by a mason 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago. He says, we look at that and go, where do you start? Oh my God. And we're kind of saying, they're two a penny here in Ireland. And again, that tells a story. And that's kind of point that John was always emphasizing, as he was kind of saying to us. He said, look, when you come to a building like that and you want to conserve it, his idea was that you should conserve it as the way it is now. You shouldn't try to restore it back to what it was. You don't want to put a roof back on it. You don't want to put it, because he said, look, that's going to take a huge amount of resources. The question then becomes, what was the roof that was on it? Was it thatched? Had it shingles? Was it slated? Where does it end? So his view is that you should just consolidate the way it is, and that type of philosophy has found its way into a lot of the works that Cork County Council have done themselves.
Not interrupt you, but
yeah.
I suppose there are so many thousands in
yes.
Cork County.
Absolutely.
That we don't have to go for funding, because
exactly.
Effectively it's the local government.
Yeah.
We're on our own resources, we don't have any help at all getting
yeah.
support from the outside. And it's a pity now, because there are a lot of these around the locality which we just are not capable of not restoring, but of even maintaining.
Exactly, yeah, that's a huge issue. And what I think if there is that you have councils that are quite limited. I was talking to someone who's with the National Monument Service, and he said, look, their budget this year has evaporated, because he said in relation to monies have gone, that central government monies have gone to the likes of the National Children's Hospital, so like they don't have a budget for doing their own works. That shows you, and that's a matter of priority, and we can understand all of that. But I suppose what I think, and pick up that point, Kevin, is that we are involved in a number of groups, and what we've seen is groups have said, listen, they started to fundraise, they started to tackle things and take it on, and sometimes there's a group that we've just involved in Donegal, and they've got a certain amount of seed funding to get advice. Again, go back to the point that Kevin says, the important thing is getting the right advice, and thereafter they've put a plan together, and we've been involved with them over the last 2 years, and they've conserved their church. They've started to do repair, but it's gone well from them, because they've taken the right advice at the very end. And like Donegal County Council and the National Monument Service have been very helpful, because they've done the right thing. But it's right, that's come back to resourcing and funding, and at the moment there's little or none. We'd hope in the next year or two that starts to free up again. It should do. But I think the huge role there is for groups to campaign and fundraise and whatnot on it. So that just gives an indication, and I want to just close off. There's a few bullet points here which I was going to say in terms of preparing a maintenance plan for your monument. What I'd say about that is that there's an example here someone brought up earlier on for a graveyard in Clonfert. Is it in Newmarket?
Yes.
Yeah, very good, which is a fantastic document. Do you mind if people have a look at it?
Oh,
maybe,
sure,
yeah, we can pass it around. Yeah,
sure.
And this was commissioned obviously by yourselves.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
John Tierney did
That's
a lot.
right.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
he does a lot of work with us.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a great document, and it shows that, look, it's what we would often say is that, look, you need to give yourself, I would say there's really 4 elements to it. First of all, is an introduction, because this is usually going to someone for either getting consent or approval, or you might be looking for funding, and this is almost like your calling card. And the introduction tells you who you are, where you're based, and what you're intending to do. That's the important to get across. So you might be Ballymagash Restoration Committee, and you're interested in a particular thing, and this document sets out what you want to do. The next section would be, and I haven't checked this, but I imagine it's the same, it provides some degree of context about the place. And that goes back to the important is if you know your monument, know the registration, and you know the history about it. And you don't, sometimes people put in a huge amount of effort. And all that does is it kind of goes, crikey, I don't have the time to read all of that. You need to sometimes just give the essential points about the place. And a good bit of bibliography, if people want to read more about it, they can. And what we often do is, and I see here it's very well done, is that there's illustrating the problems. Very simple, like no fancy drawings, but taking photographs illustrating where the problems were, where there's work to be done on the boundary. And what it also does is, so you've got your introduction, you're providing a bit of context, you're describing the site as it is currently, and the 4th thing is just outlining what you're going to do, your measures. And that's what something, when it goes into the council, they can say, listen, great, we've got your document, we know what you're doing, we're happy for you to go ahead. Or if there might be something in there and say, listen, you're being a bit ambitious, kind of rein it back. And what we would say, and I would imagine, is that these things are relatively straightforward to put together. It's good to get advice, and yes, you may need a day or two's time from an archaeologist to assist with it, or more, whatever. But the likes of the Heritage Council, particularly based in Kilkenny, they often will help to pay for reports like this, and they have done over the while. Notwithstanding the fact that, I'll pass it around? Notwithstanding the fact that at the moment funding is very tight, but I'm hoping that will change. So what I'd say there is, putting a maintenance plan together, you can do it yourself, but you should run it by maybe an archaeologist, or if you have I'd say an archaeologist would be the best start. Sometimes you'll need to bring in other experts, and that's for the example that we're working on in Donegal at the moment. Very quickly, a group, retired people who are saying, listen, we were very concerned about a particular graveyard that they had, we wanted to do something about it. They'd be the first to admit that they're not technically savvy, but my God, have they, pulled people's arms, called in favours, and what they've done is, very early in the process, they've contacted us and a local architect and said, listen, we were worried about it. What they were particularly worried is that there was a high cross within the graveyard, and they were worried that was beginning to decay, and they were really, really concerned about that. And they brought myself and a lady by the name of Caroline Dixon in just to have a look at that and say, well, what are we going to do? The issues were, is there some type of coating we put on it? Should we build a structure over it, which has been done elsewhere, build a kind of a hood over it? Should we take it down and move it indoors? Then the question is, where do you take it? Does it go to Dublin and go into storage? Or there's a Church of Ireland just adjacent to it, and the Church of Ireland, we're happy to move it in if needs be. But then there's comes an issue in terms of accessibility. So there was a huge debate about that, and we did the initial inspection with the group, but myself and Caroline walking around the building, and Eamon I think has had a look at it as well. I just kind of, I wouldn't worry about your cross. You've got a bigger problem here. We looked at the church, and it's not dissimilar to this. I can show you photographs maybe later on, but it's just that a typical roofless the gables are standing here, and the gable of the church was beginning to crack and to lean out. Now it wasn't out of plumb, it would maybe be 30 or 40 years before it would start to cause bother, but the cracking was very obvious. There was tree growth on top of it. Eamon will look at an example of this later on, and we were just kind of going, whoa, this is where your main concern should be. So we said, look, in relation to the High Cross, it's a national monument, it's of national significance. Other work needs to be done on that, and they've taken specialist advice, and that's a slower process. But what they've done in the last year and a half is that they've consolidated the church. They've done a full conservation repair on it. They've had very little funding they've got funding from the Heritage Council. They got the fund, all of their professional costs were covered by the Heritage Council, so the likes of my involvement, Eamon's involvement, Kate in our office in Donegal. But they've had auctions. They've said that the big thing that they've done is that they've created a website and that they're tapping people from the area who are living abroad and saying, listen, we're fundraising here, are you concerned about it? They've had a GoFundMe page. As I said, I can talk about it later on. But in the scope of 1.5 years, and they've also taken the right advice. They've met with National Monuments, they've met with Donegal County Council, and they've got all agreement to get the work done. And after 1.5 years, they've conserved their church as a ruin, and they're still now focusing their attention on what to do with the cross. And the feeling is some people are beginning going, look, nowadays we can record these things. There was, not by us, it was done by a university. They've done a digital scan of, which is down to, sub-millimeter accuracy. So from one point of view, we now have a very detailed record of what that monument is. And if the monument disappears in the morning, from an information point of view, we know what it is. Going back to the idea of values. So from an archaeological point of view, yeah, it would be terrible to see it go, but you know what, we've got the information. But it would be a huge loss to the values that people have in the area, because it's a way of, for both the Church of Ireland community and the Catholic community there, it's actually a unifying, because it's something that everyone can refer to. So it's very important that it be kept. The question that they have now at the moment is what are we going to do with it? And the kind of consensus coming around is that we think we leave it where it is, and we're going to do an investigation next year. Going back to the point, I think Neil, you were asking the question about to rectify. There is a slight tip in it, and we're going to have to do an investigation. We're going to brace it next year and do a small little archaeological investigation to see if there's an underlying problem. But they're taking their time in relation to that. And sometimes what you think is a priority turns out to be less of a priority when you start taking advice, okay? What I will do is for people who send out, there's a small presentation I just didn't get a chance to get to there, which outlines the summary of what a plan should be. But I think the one that's going around there is superb, and it just shows you, it doesn't have to be detailed. The best thing there are the photographs, illustrating the problems. It means someone who needs to sign off on this, maybe in Dublin or in Cork, can look at it and say, yeah, clearly they've demonstrated where the problems are. How have you found it? Have you been working through it since? Yeah.
No.
No, not yet.
I was at your presentation in Oriel House, and you said to get
yes,
one.
Yes, yeah, good, yeah.
So I did.
Yeah.
But we sent it in, and we heard nothing back.
We have nothing back. Yeah.
No.
And have you, in terms of I see a lot of the works there, like there's sycamore trees and ash trees that are growing in there.
There is, yeah. But it's the wall. It's a trunk of a tree or something is growing through the wall,
wow.
And every day you go down, there's another stone.
I know.
Up. So we have the stones.
Yes.
But the wall is our problem.
I know.
And funding for it.
Funding it for it. Yeah. That's perennial problem. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
It's pushing it out.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's so that illustrates the problem. I think you have another hurdle to go over, but the question here really is is that you've done a huge amount of work, and it's very clear what has to happen, and it's a question of keep knocking indoors and trying to get ahead with it. But it's a great piece of work. Yeah. Thank you very much.